Is it possible to learn perfect pitch? And is it something that you need to learn? This is a fascinating topic. It's a question that I get asked all the time, and it's one that I want to delve into in a little more detail in this video, because as we'll see, there are different things that are meant by perfect pitch, and there's a lot of different pros and cons to having it. So first of all, what is perfect pitch? Perfect pitch, to put it in its simplest form, is the ability to recognize a pitch just by hearing it and to know what the name of that note is. So if somebody plays a note on the piano, to be able to say, oh, that's a D, or that's an F, or that's a B flat. That's what we mean by perfect pitch. But there are actually quite a few gradations of it. And so let's start with that. There are people in the world, like Jacob Collier, for example, if you know him as one of these people, who have the ability not only to recognize a note, but even to tell you if it's a little bit too sharp or flat. This ability is exceedingly rare, but there are people that can actually say, that's a G sharp, but it's tuned just a little bit high. And to go along with that, there are people who can recognize complex clusters of notes. So, for example, Arthur Rubinstein, the great pianist, was known for being able to identify, if you were to play just something like this on the piano, he would be able to say, that's an F, and then a G, and then a B flat, and a D. Again, this is an ability that's exceedingly rare. But that would be what I would say is sort of the most extreme form of perfect pitch. And believe it or not, it has some downsides. We'll get to that in just a moment. Let's go take a step down. Then you have, of course, the people who can identify a note. And this also has some interesting gradations, because you have people, for example, that can identify a pitch on any instrument or any tone that's produced basically on anything and be able to say what it is. I had a friend, for example, with perfect pitch who said it was really helpful for being able to shift the car, because he had a manual transmission, and when it would get up to a C sharp, he knew it was time to shift into third gear. So there are people that can tell you the name of a note on a violin, on a piano, a bell, whatever it might be, and be able to name that note instantaneously. There are other people, and I happen to fall into this category myself, who have perfect pitch with regard to a specific instrument. So if I hear a note on the piano, I can tell you what it is. But if I hear that same note on the violin or a guitar, I can't always identify it. So it seems to be, for some people, very instrument specific. And generally that's the instrument that you grow up playing. And obviously, we associate these tones over time with a particular pitch, and so it's easy to see how that could happen. Then we get to a sort of a step lower, which I would still consider a form of perfect pitch. And this is actually a kind of perfect pitch that many people have. Namely, the ability to hear if something, for example, a song, is being played in the right or the wrong key. So to give you an example of this, Beethoven wrote the Moonlight Sonata in C sharp minor. So we hear it, when it's played, it sounds like this. But if you were to transpose that into C, for example, a lot easier to play, it would sound like this. Now, a lot of people right away, myself included, notice, even though all the intervals are the same, still playing basically the same thing, just a half step lower, a lot of people notice right away, that sounds wrong. That's not the Moonlight Sonata I know. Or with pop songs, if you were to take it and transpose it a little bit up or down, a lot of people recognize right away, that's something's off with the pitch, right? And that I would consider as well to be a sort of perfect pitch, albeit a sort of a lesser version of it. Now, one of the things that bothers me about a lot of online piano courses, and particularly these corporate products, these big apps that have millions of users, is that they'll oftentimes take very well-known songs and transpose them into the wrong keys because it's easier to play in those keys. So you hear the Moonlight Sonata in C minor, or they'll show you how to play Clair de Lune in D major instead of D flat. To me, that is just sacrilegious. These pieces are so famous, and to a lot of people like myself, it just sounds off. It just sounds wrong if you learn it in the wrong key. So what I do in my piano course, petersonpianoacademy.com, is we play only original pieces in the keys in which they were originally written. So you can be sure when you're learning the Moonlight Sonata, you're actually learning the real, unadulterated, unaltered Moonlight Sonata. When you learn Clair de Lune, you're learning the actual piece. So anyway, now back to perfect pitch. There's a big question surrounding, is it possible to learn perfect pitch? Now, the research on this is somewhat ambiguous. It seems to be that there's sort of a critical threshold in terms of age, a point that happens relatively early in a person's life, somewhere around 7 or 8, beyond which it's not possible to learn this sort of pure form of perfect pitch where you instantaneously know right away that note's an F sharp or a C flat or whatever. But there's some caveats to that. It is possible to train this ability. So we'll give you just a very simple example. If you were to go to sleep every night and as you're falling asleep, just play a tape recorder of the note C, for example, and you listen to it over and over and over again for hours and hours, you will start to have that in your head. And it will be easier for you when you go to the piano to say, yeah, I remember the sound of that C. I can name it. I can play it. But the research seems to indicate that in almost all cases, if you learn it as an adult, tends to fade away with time. So you might listen to that recording. Maybe in the next morning it works great. But a couple days later, it's going to be gone again. And so while this ability can sort of be strengthened as an adult, it can't really ever be learned to the same extent that a child who starts very early can learn it. I've been in contact with, of course, hundreds of musicians in my life, and I've never actually known of a single case of anybody learning perfect pitch later in life. But I'd be very curious to know your experiences with this. Maybe some of you have, or to a certain degree have learned to achieve perfect pitch. Be very, very curious. Let us know in the comments about that. But then we get on to the really important issue, namely, is perfect pitch actually something that's worth investing lots of time to try to learn? And I would say a resounding no. Now, what you need to have instead of perfect pitch is a very strong relative pitch. So in other words, if somebody plays a C, you need to be able to sing an E. You need to be able to go from that C and be able to sing a G or an A. That's what we call relative pitch. And that's extremely important in becoming a good musician. It's something that you can learn and develop, and it's very well known that this can be developed. Every college music program has ear training courses designed to improve exactly this ability. So I would say work on strengthening your relative pitch abilities, and don't worry too much about the acquisition of perfect pitch. Now, like I mentioned before, perfect pitch actually has some advantages and disadvantages. Now, what could possibly be the disadvantages of perfect pitch? Well, I'll give you one. I had a friend, he belonged to this category that I mentioned before of people that had this sort of extreme form of perfect pitch. He could tell whether a note was a little too high or a little too low. He was an organist, and he had to play a concert once on an organ which happened to be slightly out of tune. The entire instrument was sort of shifted down about a half step. Now, nobody in the audience would notice this because the relationships between the notes were still fine. It was just that the whole thing was sort of a bit lower. But for him, he had learned the music basically in a different key. It was so impossible for him to play on this organ that was a step lower. And the same issue applies to transposition. I've noticed that musicians that have perfect pitch often have a very hard time transposing pieces into a new key. For a lot of other people, it's no problem whatsoever once you learn how to do it. But if you have perfect pitch, you take it up into a new key and suddenly everything sounds so terribly wrong, and you only associate the sounds of that piece with particular pitches, and that perfect pitch ability sort of overshadows everything else. So that can actually be a real disadvantage. Now, in terms of the advantages, there are obviously some really cool advantages to perfect pitch besides it being just a cool party trick. One of which is that you can sense the sort of development of key centers and the forms of musical pieces in a way that you might not be able to otherwise. So, for example, if you're listening to a symphony, you might notice that the piece starts out in C minor and then moves in the middle section into G major and then moves into E. These are things that a lot of times are lost on people that don't have perfect pitch. And so it's like opening up this additional dimension to music. But, there have even been some very well-known composers and musicians at the highest level who didn't have perfect pitch. So being a great musician certainly does not require having perfect pitch, and there are many other things that are much more important to spend your time on. So those are just a few thoughts about perfect pitch. I'd love to know from you, what sort of perfect pitch do you have? What sort of abilities do you have in terms of tone recognition? Have you been able to improve your skills with perfect pitch? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.